So, U.S. President Donald Trump has publicly criticized South Korea for not being helpful as he continues to lash out at allies for their lack of support in the conflict with Iran. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron is set to visit South Korea today for the first time since taking office in 2017, making him the first French leader to visit South Korea in 11 years. For more on this, we're joined today by Professor Andrew Millard, head of the Department of International Relations at Changwon National University. Professor Millard, thanks for coming on today.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So Trump says Seoul hasn't been too helpful to Washington, even though American troops are stationed on the peninsula close to what he called a nuclear threat. How should South Korea and other allies respond to this claim?
So you're right. So Trump has been, in the past few days in particular, very vocal, very critical of all of his allies, really. And this really shows a lot of frustration that Donald Trump in particular is having because of this really prolonged war in Iran. So basically, Donald Trump has started this conflict, assuming that all of his allies would just unconditionally support this invasion, not really understanding that they recognize that this is not a legal invasion, so they're not supporting. Now, he's lashing out really at sort of the easier targets. So in Asia, this means lashing out at South Korea and also Japan, and in Europe, really focusing on the bigger powers like the United Kingdom and France. Now, for South Korea, if we focus on Korea, really, this could have very huge implications for security, especially in the wider Northeast Asian region. In the short term, we could see the reallocation of military assets, so troops and assets from Korea to the Middle East and elsewhere. But really, in the long term, this could threaten the US-South Korea Military Forces Treaty, which has been in place for 75 years. This has created the status quo in Northeast Asia, nice and stable. If the US start to withdraw troops and assets, this could really threaten Northeast Asian stability. And so really for South Korea, they need to try to convince the United States that they are a strong ally, that when they are really needed, they will be there. But they also need to maybe diversify and start strengthening security partnerships with other allies as well.
Right, like you just mentioned, it's not just South Korea that's being targeted. Trump has been hitting out at other European allies over the Iran war. And some analysts say growing resistance from NATO allies exposes, deepening divisions within this alliance. And given that NATO was already under, strain over issues like Ukraine and Greenland, what does this suggest about the future of NATO?
So again, Donald Trump has couple of days, he's been really threatening to withdraw from NATO. It'll be very interesting to hear what he has to say in his speech shortly about this issue. However, what has been a little bit more concerning, especially last night, was that Marco Rubio also came out and said, look, when this conflict with Iran finishes, the US, we really have to reevaluate our relationship with NATO. So this is looking not just like Donald Trump's personal rhetoric. This is really looking like the United States administration is really taking this very seriously. Now, in order to withdraw, they do technically need approval from the Senate. So that could maybe where the US pushes back a little bit. But in terms of the general divisions in NATO, apart from the US criticism, actually, if we look at Europe itself, we see a lot of unity. So with Ukraine, when Donald Trump threatened to withdraw support for Ukraine, we created the coalition of the willing. With Greenland, we saw a very quick reaction against the US in that one. And also with Iran, we're seeing the Europeans stick very closely together, following the principles, the values of NATO. So in the long term, we could definitely see a NATO without the US, potentially. If that happens, there will be one big winner, and that will be Russia. I'm sure right now in Moscow, in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin is very happy to be hearing these sort of ideas.
Yeah, I see. And President Lee Jae-myung today in South Korea will meet with French President Macron, and they're set to hold a summit tomorrow. How do you see them addressing the tensions in the Middle East?
So for both of these states, both countries, France and South Korea, they'll be looking for a very quick end to this conflict, as pretty much every country is, but they'll be looking for a diplomatic end to this solution, to this conflict, and sort of no escalation. We do see slightly different interests from the French and the South Koreans, though. For France, they're really looking to support their allies. Macron, he's been very clear that France is here purely in a defensive role. So they'll be supporting United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, their other allies in the region. They'll be wanting to support their own nationals in the region and also other areas like Gaza, continuing humanitarian aid for Gaza, again, encouraging the two-state solution in Israel and so on. So that's really where the French focus will be, purely defensive in the region. For the South Koreans, the interests lie much more in sort of the oil, opening the Straits of Hormuz, because South Korea is more dependent on oil from the Middle East. Now, where the South Koreans can really commit to long-term participation is in, once the conflict finishes, a sort of a naval role, because as we know, South Korea, off the eastern coast of Africa, around Somalia, in the anti-piracy area, they have been involved in the EU Operation Atalanta, and they've been very committed to that and been very successful. So I'm sure President Lee will want to emphasize this, that they are committed to being in the region, to being part of some sort of coalition to maintain the open Straits of Hormuz.
Right, and Professor Millard, before I let you go, what might be some of the key bilateral issues they might likely focus on tomorrow?
So this is a very important one. So it's 140 years of French-South Korean relations. So this is quite a significant visit from Macron. They'll be talking obviously about security. I think that's going to be top of the agenda no matter what. But they'll also be doing cultural issues. So educational exchanges, people-to-people exchanges. There'll be discussions on trade and cooperation in AI, space and aviation, automobiles. Also in energy, so both are focused on decarbonization and also nuclear energy. Now, nuclear energy, actually, we've seen a little bit of competition between South Korea and France in that area. So maybe this is where we can actually see France maybe looking at South Korea more as a strategic partner coming up. So this is the first time that Macron is coming to South Korea. In almost 10 years he's been in office. So we have to look at this question, why now? Why after almost 10 years, just before he leaves office? So this sort of maybe signals that France now sees South Korea, similarly like to Japan, as much more of a strategic partner in Northeast Asia.
Right. We'll have to see how that meeting plays out tomorrow. All right, Professor Millard, thank you so much for taking the time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.